Lesson 6, what were the consequences of the Berlin blockade? This is the last content lesson. The next lesson will be merely evaluative, where you look at who was responsible and the arguments have been put forth for both sides being responsible, and you're going to have to come down on one side or the other and, of course, be able to support it. So this lesson looks at really the city of Berlin, and we remember from way early on, from lesson 1, that Berlin, at the Yalta Conference, was decided to be mutually shared, even though very obviously it's inside what was then the Soviet occupation zone. And of course, at Potsdam, this agreement was reassured. So you look at it here and you see that any person living in West Berlin would be completely surrounded by the communist East Germany, but it would be sort of like an oasis of capitalism, if you will, in the middle of the communist heart of Eastern Germany. Now, one of the big long-term causes of this conflict was the fact that Stalin became increasingly paranoid about Western influence in his areas of control. You saw that Stalin had very much taken over all of Eastern Europe. He had put in Soviet governments, and that was all fine and well when you can control whole blocks of areas. And the Eastern Germany was, well, I suppose in Stalin's eyes, well governed by a communist government. Sort of the workers' paradise that he was trying to create was becoming that way in Eastern Germany. However, in Berlin, you still have this joint zone of occupation with the Allies on one side and the Soviets on the other. And the differences the differences in the perspectives are very noticeable. The Allies, through things like the Marshall Plan, are taking a very different approach with Western Europe than the Soviets are with the East. Very simply, in Western Europe, the Allies are trying to speed up the economic recovery so that wealthy, prosperous, successful nations can become good capitalists and good allies of the United States. And the same was true for West Berlin. So they very much fixed West Berlin. They very much tried to recreate the economy of West Berlin. They very much tried to make West Berlin prosperous. Counter that was Stalin. He was the opposite. He very much wanted, more particularly in Germany than anywhere else, to keep Germany weak. His paranoia of a strong Germany, his paranoia of German invasion runs very, very, very much through his thinking in the eastern sector, and most particularly his thinking with East Germany, and to that extension, East Berlin. So he does not put the investment into East Berlin. East Berlin remains very, very poor compared to the West Berlin that's growing into sort of a prosperous capitalist side, and it doesn't take much to do that. I mean, you can literally at this particular point walk from West to East Berlin and see the stark differences in the zones of occupation. So the Allies in Berlin, within the Soviet zone, really try to sort of get that affluent capitalist way of life, to show people in the East that the ideology of communism is wrong and against their interests. Okay, not to mention the fact that the Allies can easily observe Soviet activities. They are in the East. They're in the Eastern Bloc. The Soviets aren't walking around the streets of Paris, and certainly they aren't walking around the streets of London, but the Allies can walk around the streets of a major European capital city within the Soviet zone, and they could see what's going on behind the Iron Curtain. There's that sort of concept of, we're being infiltrated. Now, in the very short term, the focus on building the affluent West created such a sharp contrast that it undermined what Stalin was doing. And Stalin began to fear a strong, democratic, reunited Germany. He did not want Western money, Western currency, money, or democratic ideas undermining his control of East Berlin. So in 1948, things start to come to a head. The first step, really, in 1948 seems, at least on its surface, innocuous, but when you view it from the perspective of Stalin, it sort of makes sense why this would be this would be a worry. It's very much America versus Russia game right now, or America versus the Soviet Union game. And in 1948, mostly down to the financial concerns of the British desperately broke at this particular point for World War II, are losing bits of their empire left, right, and center. India is going to leave in 1948, and they're looking for ways to shed the cost that they're spending on keeping this worldwide empire. And as a result, the British merged their zone of occupation with the U.S. zone into what's known as Bizonia. And make no mistake, Bizonia is largely dominated by the United States. So now you have, instead of four powers, or rather three powers, the British, the French, and the Americans, really you now have a small French occupation zone that doesn't border whatsoever Eastern Germany, and one large, overwhelmingly U.S.-dominated zone known as Bizonia, bordering Eastern Germany, and that's a direct threat to Stalin. The second part was really disagreements of what was known as the Allied Control Commission, the ACC. The Allied Control Commission was established in 1945 as a joint governing body to govern the city of Berlin. It was agreed at the ultimate Potsdam that the Allied Control Commission would be almost like the mayor's office, but all of the countries would have an input. By 1948, Soviet representatives wanting domination totally of the Allied Control Commission walk out. They blame Western attitudes and Western thinking and capitalism for making it unworkable. And this sort of is a very symbolic breakdown of any sort of cooperation in the controlling of Berlin. The Allies take it one step further. Stalin had always feared Western money floating around the Eastern Bloc. More particularly, they did not want Germany to be strong. And one of the ways a country becomes strong, and more particularly independent, is it has its own currency. The Allied zones are included in the Marshall Plan. And overwhelmingly, American money starts flowing into West Berlin, not to mention West Germany. And as a result, Soviets, trying to prevent all of this money coming through, start to do things like, hold up and search road and rail into Berlin. By June of 1948, that currency becomes a reality. They announced plans that in a very short time, they're going to create a West German state. And part of that state is going to have its own central bank with its own currency, known as the Deutschmark. And the USSR doesn't want this to happen. So what they say is that they will create their own currency, the Ostmark or the Eastmark, for their zones and East Berlin. Now, the sort of currency war, it is petty. On the other hand, it is also symbolic. It is what Stalin fears, sort of the rebirth of Germany, more particularly in the West. So the fifth step is the 24th of June, 1948. Stalin, sick in his eyes of Western interference in the Soviet zones, cuts off all road, rail, and canal traffic from the western sector of Germany, Bizonia, into West Berlin. And what he's trying to do here is say, listen, we're just going to cut you off. You cannot get in. We will force you to pull out of Bizonia and abandon plans for the development of the German zones. Why road and rail? Well, it's a principal transportation system in 1948. Stalin thinks this will be much more effective. He also grossly underestimates how much can be carried by plane. Now, as we see, this springs Truman into action. He detests Stalin. He's not going to back down from this confrontation. He's determined to stand up to the USSR and show how serious he is about the ideas of the Truman Doctrine. The idea that he will contain Soviet expansion. By containment, he will not under any circumstances allow West Berlin to fall into Soviet hands. He felt that if Berlin fell, the other German zones could be next, and the Truman Doctrine, and sort of will be for naught. He says very clearly that he wants Berlin to be a symbol of freedom behind the Iron Curtain. And what their response to that is, without trying to provoke a war, becomes known as the Berlin airlift. Had he tried to run the basic blockade along the border, it would have been incursion on border territory, and therefore it would have probably broken out in World War III. What we have here is a solution, and the solution is to fly supplies. The Allies wouldn't give in to Stalin if they did this. They also wouldn't provoke a war, and they would also put the pressure back on Stalin. He knew he couldn't shoot the planes down because that would be him starting the war. It would be in violation of international agreements that the skies were effectively fair game. And he has to basically allow them to do it. But he figures, Stalin takes the gamble. There's no way they can do it. But the Allies do. It's one of the truly remarkable logistical miracles of all time. And the fact that they, for 11 months, fly food and other supplies directly into Berlin. Every day, the British, French, and U.S. planes feed and clothe and give provisions to the people of West Berlin. And they depended on this for everything, from coal to heat their food, their homes, to dried potatoes, powered with eggs, cans of meat. And, all that said, the hardships they had to endure were quite great because Berlin had been cut off from so many of the essentials. Again, I mentioned coal. Most power plants are operated by coal. The lack of coal meant there was only 4 hours of electricity per day. In total, over 11 months, 275,000 flights carried 1.5 million tons of supplies. At its peak at Berlin's airports, one plane is landing every 3 minutes. The airlift itself is tremendously costly, and really the keeping up this symbolic keeping Germany alive does cost the Allies a great deal, particularly the Americans who bankroll it. And it's, like I said, $100 million in those days is quite costly. And it does also, too, it's important to remember the fact that 79 people died. These people didn't die because they were shot down by the Russians. They did die because planes crash. When you're flying into a very congested airspace at a rate of a plane every 3 minutes, there are accidents, and accidents did happen, which cost the lives of 79 brave servicemen. So, after 11 months and realizing that the Allies weren't going to give in, on the 12th of May, Stalin's hopes that he would force the Allies to sort of back down are for naught. He does call off the blockade. So, this is actually the most important thing if you look at the spec. You need to have a good handle on what the results of the crisis were. Okay, there are really 5 of them. They're very important. The first one is that it becomes a very powerful symbol of the greatly increased East-West rivalry. Truman saw this as a victory. West Berlin survived. The Americans and their allies stood up to the USSR, who were doing something horrible in his eyes to the German people. Stalin, on the other hand, who was defeated, suffered a massive humiliation. He, of course, in true Stalinesque fashion, controls everything. He doesn't lead the Soviet people to believe that whatsoever, but in reality, it does show that the USA here has the upper hand, at least at this particular point. Berlin itself will become a powerful symbol of Cold War tensions. The USA will see it as an oasis of freedom in the middle of communist repression. Well, the Soviets will take a very different look. They'll see it as a bone in the throat, a cancer, if you will, a cancer or a bone in the throat that's disrupting the pleasant workers' paradise of East Germany. So you see propaganda and action very thoroughly in the Berlin blockade, as both sides are seeing each other in a negative light. Of course, the idea that the Allies are doing this is really a disruption, an evil perpetrated on the Soviet zone. On the flip side of that, the Allies see what the Soviets are doing is purely wrong, and therefore what they're doing is heroic. Very starkly, it confirms the divisions of Germany. Right after the Berlin airlift, the Berlin blockade, Germany is divided formally into 2 nations. Within a few days of the crisis, the Allies join all of their zones into what's known as the Federal German Republic, or West Germany, which becomes its own country and gets its own currency. And the Soviets do the same by making East Germany formally the German Democratic Republic, or most commonly known as East Germany. And these 2 countries are really become legitimate nations, and it formally divides Germany, which was, up until this point, just occupied. It also leads to a military alliance. The most important military alliance, and one that's still with us today, is what's known as NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In 1949, in April, after the Berlin blockade was over, the U.S. signs a treaty that puts 12 states in a military alliance, a defensive alliance. And all of those 12 states agree that if the Soviets expand into Europe, or the Soviets expand anywhere, that those countries will work together to prevent this expansion. It's been said in many ways that NATO was created to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And NATO obviously is viewed very, very much threatening by the USSR, who respond with increasing tension and creating their own military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact actually comes quite a bit after NATO, but the aggressive alliance, as Stalin will call it, will lead to a formal military alliance of the 8 nations of the East designed to counter what they saw as the threat of NATO trying to take over the Soviet sphere of influence. It had a sort of a joint command structure, and the Soviet Supreme Commander would control all actions of the Warsaw Pact countries. It basically makes the militaries of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, for instance, completely subservient to the military of the Soviet Union. And what we see in 1955 as a result of both the creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact is, the formal division of the world into 2 heavily armed alliance systems, which will increase tensions and, of course, increase the threat of major global war if these 2 alliance systems were ever to get in an argument big enough to warrant it. And finally, the last one is, and it's important to note that this sets a pattern for Cold War confrontations. Berlin really shows how things will play out. It shows, number one, how suspicious the USA and the USSR are of each other, how they would try and obstruct each other in any way they could, such as, blockading road and rail. Actually, at one point during the Berlin blockade, Stalin flew weather balloons into the flight paths of the airports, forcing the planes to dodge weather balloons very dangerously in their landing, but they still didn't deter them from actually landing. But these are the types of things that they would do. They also saw, as we can see from this lovely picture, milk. And Douglas is a U.S. aircraft manufacturer. It's milk, the weapon of democracy. It shows that basically they'll bombard each other in each other's countries with propaganda to show that they're in the right here. Berlin also shows that each side was not willing to go to war with the other. If they weren't willing to go to war over Berlin, if Stalin wasn't willing to shoot these planes down, it's possible that this war would remain a Cold War and not a hot one. But what you get nonetheless is a very tense balance developing. And this tense balance of 2 countries in 2 very, 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 very huge armed camps, capable of destroying each other, really, will exist through the entire period of the Cold War, much thanks to the Berlin blockade. So it's an incredibly important event, which really, if there's any doubt that the Cold War was on, and people had started to use the term Cold War by 1946. After the Berlin blockade was over, everybody knew that the Cold War, or what sort of the pattern that would define the next 50 years, had fundamentally developed.